Shalom, everyone. Today's portion is called Behalotecha, and it begins with the instructions that the light of the menorah was to be structured in such a way that the light was to shine toward the people. So the Torah teaches us that God uses ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary tasks, and that they are judged by their hearts and given specific roles. We read that our Creator gave roles to the Levites, to Aaron, to Moshe, and every major character in the Torah. And in the same way, He gave you and me a role. And when we find it and we step into it with all our hearts, we too can shine. Israel was formed to be a light to all the nations. For the first half of my life, I tried to shine my light and the light of my understanding, but the results were empty. All the religions and the ideologies that I delved into taught me their truths, and it was easy to believe their wonderful promises, but over time, I found that they didn't fill that void that was still in me. I certainly wasn't being a light to anyone. And that story changed after I turned my life over to God, the God of Israel, and to His principles. I experienced one miracle after another, just like the story of our people. His principles do stand the test of time. And these stories show us that He always keeps His promises. When we change His words and put our words, we are only hurting ourselves. For example, this portion shows us that His commandments were not meant just for the Hebrews. In chapter 9, verse 14, God said, "There shall be one chukah for you, whether stranger or citizen of the country." And later in chapter 15, we'll read that again, but this time it'll say, there is only one Torah for the stranger and who is the ger, and the citizen, the native born of the land. Last Sunday, we received the terrible news that 12 IDF soldiers and 2 separate tanks lost their lives in this horrible war. And I listened to Caroline Glick. I highly recommend her to you. And she always says things that just as they are. And she doesn't beat around the bush or try to please people. And she said that these brave soldiers were put in positions where they should not have been, and that they were like sitting ducks, that government leaders were making decisions that are putting them in harm's way. She goes into detail in it, so I highly recommend that you listen to her. If you want the link, I can send it to you. She also said that there was a lot of intel passed down to them before the October 7th massacre. But one man, and I won't mention his name, who sat in on those intel meetings, decided to keep it from the Prime Minister Netanyahu and from those in the army who could have taken steps to prevent it. Now, it's easy for us to cast blame, and everyone's looking to do that, not only in Israel, but around the world. And I'm sure many are asking, just as they did after the last Holocaust, where was God in all this? I can't trust the media today, so I look to our scriptures for some answers. Now, in this portion, in Numbers 10, verse 9, God told Moshe, "When you are at war in your land against an aggressor who attacks you, you shall sound short blasts on the trumpets, that you may be remembered before your God, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, and be delivered from your enemies." I was thinking, where are the trumpets today that God told us to blast so that we may be remembered before Him? Psalm 44 tells us, "We have heard with our ears, O God. Our fathers have told us what deeds you performed in their days, in the times of old. With your hand you planted them, displacing nations. You afflicted people and cast them out. For they did not get land in possession by their own sword, nor did their own arm save them. But your right hand and your arm and the light of your presence, because you favorably accepted them. You are my King, O God. Command deliverance for Jacob. Through you we will push down our enemies. Through your name we will trample down those who raise up against us, For I will not trust in my bow, nor shall my sword save me. But you saved us from our enemies and have put to shame those who hate us. So here he's saying we can't trust in our own army. We can't trust in foreign nations or in anyone else but our Father, our God in heaven. And can you imagine if the Israeli government today stopped bowing to the pressures put on them by enemy governments, including the USA, and started trusting in God who created us? How different the outcome would be. And I could just picture the trumpeters marching in front of the IDF forces, sounding the trumpets, announcing that God is with us. Our enemies would quake like they did when we marched through the desert on our way to the promised land. They all heard about us. Lately I've heard a lot about Jewish pride. How can we be proud about something that we didn't choose? I wasn't chosen to be born Jewish. I could be proud of something that I accomplished. Jewish pride needs nothing to God if we are not obedient to his Torah. Pride didn't keep Pharaoh safe, and pride won't keep us safe. It won't stop anti-Semitism. And we need to understand that anti-Semitism is really being anti-God of Israel. Now, in stark contrast with pride is humility. And in chapter 10, we read that Moshe was the humblest of men. But even he had to learn how to trust the only one who chose him for his role. And here we read that Moshe urged Hovav, his father-in-law's son, to stay with them, to remain with them as they traveled. And he said to him, "For you know where to camp, and you can be our guide." But didn't we just read in chapter 9, verses 22 to 23, where it says, whether it was 2 days or a month or a year, however long the cloud lingered over the tabernacle, the Israelites remained encamped and didn't set out, and only when it lifted did they break camp. On a sign from the Lord, they made camp. On a sign from the Lord, they broke camp. They observed the Lord's command at the Lord's bidding through Moses. So Moses had seen all this. He had just spoken face to face with God. He knew that God would lead them. He saw the physical sign of the cloud. If Moses still asked a person who was not even an Israelite to guide them, how much more can we expect to struggle with our trusting him? But the beauty of walking with God is that we are all given the same opportunities to learn how to trust him. Joshua, Moses, Aaron, Miriam, they all failed. But God never abandoned them. They did suffer the consequences of their lack of trust, of the things that they did, but he always gave them another chance. And he does that with us. That's what keeps us humble. Now, another principle I learned here, expanding upon this lack of trust, is do not complain. Don't kvetch. Chapter 11:1 says, the people took to complaining bitterly before Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, who heard and was angry, incensed, and a fire of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh broke out against them, ravaging the outskirts of the camp. So Moses prayed and the fire died down. Then in verse 4, it says, the Asaf Suf, the rabble rousers. This is not to be confused with the, what was that word? The Erev Rav. This was Asaf Suf. Those were Jews and Gentiles. We don't know who they were, but they felt this gluttonous craving. And then the Israelites wept and said, if only we had meat to eat. What were they talking about? They left Egypt with lots of cattle. They also had manna provided for them on a daily basis, except on Shabbat. God said, you want meat? I'll give you meat. A whole month until it comes out of your noses, your nostrils, and becomes disgusting to you because you have rejected Yud He Vav He Adonai, who is among you, by whining, kvetching, complaining, and saying, "Oi, why did we ever leave Egypt?" The meat was still between their teeth, not yet chewed, when the anger of the Lord blazed forth against the people. And the Lord struck the people with a very severe plague. Now we can cry out, "Where is God?" But really what we need to ask is, where are we? After this, Moshe complained to God, more complaining. And Moshe, he complained to God in chapter 11:14. I cannot carry all these people by myself, for it is too much for me. I remember our own rabbi would say that. But where did Moshe get the idea that God wouldn't be there with him every step of the way? Because he was. So to lift some of the burden from his shoulders, God chose 70 elders and put some of the ruach, the spirit that he had placed on Moshe, on them. It's really hard for us to understand what that means because spirit is not physical. Did God physically remove some of his spirit from Moshe? Let's look at it from a more practical perspective. Luke said that the more that is given to us, the more is required. Now, Moshe was given a very great commission. But by complaining and not trusting, really what he was doing was diminishing the value of his role, his God-given role of leading these people. So the less of the spirit within him would be needed. I don't believe we can actually measure the amount of spiritual essence within us. We can't boast of having more than others. We're all given the same amount of faith, the same amount of spirit at the time of conception. But as it says in Jeremiah, let him who boasts boast in this, that he understands and knows me, that I am God who exercises mercy, justice, and righteousness on the earth, for I delight in these things, declares the Lord. So that's what we can boast about, not having more spirit or being more holy than someone else. I think we all begin with the same amount of spirit. But when we say a resounding yes to God, and when we are willing to learn, to trust him no matter how great the challenge, God will be present with us in ways that are indescribable. And his essence can shine forth from us, from our lives, just like his essence, the light before the menorah. It doesn't mean that we won't fail. We're human. But on the other hand, every time we say no to God, by refusing to step into something that he is asking us to do, we diminish his blessings in our lives, and the less we shine. Joshua also complained to Moses about two men, Medad and Eldad, who didn't come down to the tent of meeting with the other 70 elders. But these two men prophesied from where they were. Again, we don't know exactly what that looked like, but we don't hear about them again, before or after, which shows us that the attention was not to be placed upon these two men, but upon what they did, upon their words. Moses simply replied to Joshua that he wished that all of God's people, all of his people, would be prophets. You know, when I get frustrated and I think, who am I to speak God's words? Or why would anyone listen to me? Am I not complaining and not trusting the call of God on my own life? And again, next we read about the complaints of Moshe's sister Miriam. Her pride as a prophetess caused her to speak behind Moshe's back to Aaron in a derogatory way, saying, "Aren't we also God's prophets? Aren't we also God's prophets?" This is Lashon Hara, the evil tongue. And this resulted in her affliction with Sa'arat. It's so important enough that God put it as the 9th commandment. Miriam and Aaron were reminded that God spoke to prophets in dreams, but to Moshe he spoke face to face. Aaron had already been humbled by his failure with the incident of the golden calf. So he begged Moshe not to allow their sister to be like the walking dead. Moshe was on the receiving end of this gossip, could have enjoyed revenge, but instead he begged God to heal her. Now that, to me, is true humility. It takes a lot to get to that place in our lives. And the battle, our battle between pride and humility, is a constant. You know, the world is heating up, and it's our fault. The first step is to heal ourselves and the world, to heal ourselves and the world, and it's to acknowledge our part in it. And that takes humility, not pride. I think that the Ruach within each of us is connected to the Ruach in all of us. Judaism has that understanding. It says, to save one life is like saving the entire world. When each of us breaks a commandment or doesn't trust God in some way, we add to the global spiritual darkness. That's huge. It's hard to fathom. But there's only one God and one connected humanity. When we say no to him, preferring to do things our own way, he turns his face from us and does not protect us from evil. When we complain instead of being grateful for everything he's provided for us, we suffer the plagues that ensue. When we exercise humility over pride, we win. Can you imagine what this world would be like if we stopped complaining? If we were thankful for who we are and for what we have, and simply said yes to our Creator? I will do and I will obey. Shabbat Shalom.